Okay, we are live.
Okay, I think we're just going to wait just a couple more minutes as people are continuing to come into the room. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Margot Somerville, and I am your president of Akron City Council. Today's session is one of two community engagement informational sessions regarding American Rescue Plan Act funding and what it means to the city of Akron. The infusion of federal funding through the American Rescue Plan Act, also known as Arpa, presents us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to strategically invest $145 million into our city. In-person listening sessions will also be held in each of our 10 wards. We understand that each community is different and has different needs. So please make sure you also attend the session in your ward. Your input in this process is critical. We need to hear from you. We have made all provisions to capture your input. You will hear more about how you can share your ideas throughout this presentation. I do want to take an opportunity to acknowledge the Akron City Council members who are present and online with us this afternoon. We have Councilwoman Linda Amobian. She is Councilwoman at Large. Councilwoman Nancy Holland, Ward 1. Councilman Phil Lombardo, Ward 2. Councilwoman Sharon Connor, Ward 10. Thank you so much, council members, for joining us this afternoon. I now want to take an opportunity to introduce our panelists. We have council leadership, Jeff Fusco, who is councilman at large and also vice president for Akron City Council. We also have Mike Freeman, who is councilman Ward 9 and who is president pro tem. We also have online with us Shelly Goodrich, deputy director of the City of Akron Finance Department, and Gabby Bryant, member of Guidehouse Consulting Team. After the presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions. We ask that you make note of your questions and hold them until the end of the presentation. At that time, you will be able to type your questions right into the chat. We actually have online with us our Chief of Staff, Dr. Joan Williams, and our Council Clerk, Sarah Biviano, who will be asking those questions and directing them to the appropriate panelist. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy Director Shelly Goodrich.
Thank you, President Somerville. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this informational session today. As President Somerville said, my name is Shelly Goodrich. I'm the Deputy Finance Director for the City of Akron. I wanted to spend just a few minutes bringing you all up to speed on the competitive process the city went through to find Guidehouse, who is going to be presenting to you today. They are our consulting firm who will be leading us through this transformational time at the City of Akron and helping make sure that we are doing everything correctly for the audit compliance with the federal government. So when we originally found out that we were going to be obtaining these dollars from the federal government, I can tell you I lost sleep at night with the amount of work that it's going to put on our finance team and all aspects of city departments. And I wanted to make sure that we were good stewards of these transformational dollars and that we were ahead of the game in regards to the eligibility requirements for the dollars, as well as making sure that we are doing everything necessary for good audit records for the federal government and making sure that we are not subject to any kind of federal clawback of these funds, as we want all of these funds to really impact change in the Akron community. Back in May, when we knew we were getting these funds, we developed a request for qualification. That's a proposal that we send out to local and national firms to do this work for the City of Akron. And it was quite an extensive RFQ, request for qualification, that outlined what the city was looking for in a partner as we move forward through this process. We went ahead and posted that publicly and distributed that, and we had responses were due back to us by June 4th, 2021. We received 6 excellent responses from a mix of national and local firms. We then convened a diverse group of city employees to evaluate the responses and narrowed the pool down to 3 firms who would be selected to give us a comprehensive presentation on their experience and why they wanted to work with Akron on this project. Those comprehensive presentations were done in July, as you can see. And after those presentations, we all deliberated and decided that Guidehouse was the firm that we wanted to partner with on this project. And as we look towards spending these funds in our community, Guidehouse is acting in an advisory role to the city on eligibility and audit compliance. And they're really here to help us make sure that, we are doing everything that's required of this act, and that we are making sure that, like I said, we're good stewards of these dollars. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and turn this over to Gabby Bryant. She is with the Guidehouse team. We've been working very closely together throughout the start of this project. And as we're going through and developing projects and looking at what can be eligible under ARPA. So Gabby, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can introduce the Guidehouse team and take it away.
Thanks, Shelly. Like Shelly mentioned, my name is Gabby Bryant. I am the project manager working with the City of Akron, and I'm supported by a really great team, some of which are on today. Priam, who's another manager with Guidehouse, Janelle and Sharon, both senior consultants, and Mitch Lindstrom, who is a consultant. We all kind of come with a very diverse background, a lot of experience as far as reporting and compliance. We are also supported and kind of overseen by our director, Dave Matisoff, who's been doing a lot of this work in the city of Dayton as well. I wanted to take this time to talk a little bit about Guidehouse and our experience and what we've been seeing throughout the course of this pandemic. Guidehouse has been given the opportunity to work with a number of different cities, states, and counties throughout the country since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We work with over 26 cities, states, and counties on how best to deal with the kind of large number of federal funds coming into these localities. And through the course of that, we've developed a COVID-19 Center of Excellence where we're sharing best practices that we're seeing across the country of how to deal with such large funds coming in to our communities. When the federal government gives cities and counties and states large monies, there's a lot of strings attached. There's a lot of reporting. They want to make sure that the cities are being good stewards and capturing the costs and projections of those dollars accurately. And also, too, making sure that that information is being shared with the public as much as possible. And so the role that Guidehouse has been able to play in this is really getting an understanding of what the federal government expects of these localities. We actually have a lot of federal clients as well. We work with a lot of health systems in our practice too, and also our public and state and local experience prior to this pandemic has really set us up well to be able to bridge the gaps between translating the federal requirements and meeting the needs of the communities that we're seeing throughout this pandemic. And that's why we have focused on playing that advisory role that Shelly mentioned before. So we really come to the city basically with a good understanding of the legislation, which is about 151 pages, good understanding of what that legislation is requiring. And we hear from citizens, from city administration, from the city council to start to understand where their priorities are and how we can translate those priorities into what the federal government has said is eligible. So specifically with the American Rescue Plan Act, the federal government has allocated $1.9 trillion in economic stimulus to multiple sections of our economy that can include things like the public health care, city and state, local governments. And this is all in an effort to address the effects of COVID-19 and avoid any kind of prolonged, ongoing recession that we might see because of COVID-19. The American Rescue Plan Act really gave cities and states a chance to be proactive, whereas the CARES coronavirus funds relief gave cities a chance to deal right now with what they were seeing. So ARPA gave cities and states the chance to think about recovery, what that's going to look like. And it's a much longer term process as well. So we have until December 2024 to obligate these funds, and then December 2026 to actually expend them. Like I mentioned, the American Rescue Plan includes a lot of money in different areas, some of which includes housing assistance, rental assistance. The focus of our contract with the city of Akron is that $350 billion that's state and local, that came in state and local aid. And of that $350 billion, the city of Akron got $145 million. And what that means and why that's really important to understand around these funds is they have to be in response to the pandemic. They have to really think about how we can avoid further harmful impacts that we're seeing because of COVID-19. This pandemic has caused a lot of loss of life. It's caused a lot of economic hardship for folks. And there's a number of impacts that we've seen that I don't think anyone could have planned for, as far as increases in violence or increases necessary around mental health services. Another really important thing to understand about this funding is that it is a one-time source of funding. So Unfortunately, the federal government will not be providing millions of dollars to the city of Akron, ongoing, but we do have this really transformational amount of money coming into the city, and we want to think about how we can set ourselves up well to bring Akron and make sure that Akron is ready for whatever the future brings. So now I want to talk a little bit about the specific eligible uses for these types of dollars. The federal government has created a very kind of strict structure around what these dollars can be used for, and they've categorized it into 5 main categories. So support the public health response. These types of things include continued contact tracing, vaccination efforts. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, and even though vaccination rates have been increasing, we're still seeing the impacts of COVID-19, the health impacts on COVID-19 on residents. Secondly, is responding to the negative economic impact that COVID-19 has had. We know that businesses had to shut down, they were unable to provide services, people were not able to keep their jobs. We've seen a lot of different economic hardship due to the pandemic. And right now, with continued supply chain issues, we know that there are a lot of difficulties that families and business leaders, business owners, and employees are facing because of the pandemic. Third is the premium pay for essential workers, pretty self-explanatory there. Revenue loss is the 4th category, and that's really to help the city government think about how the pandemic has affected their processes and their services that they were able to provide. City government depends on different sources of income in order to, provide all of the city services. And the federal government recognized that with the pandemic, some of those sources of income were really affected, and provided a very specific equation on how city governments could estimate and basically make up for that shortfall so that we don't see any decrease, hopefully, in our city services due to a loss of revenue. And then finally is the infrastructure investments. And those infrastructure investments are very specific. I know that there's been a lot of discussion around the infrastructure bill that's currently in the federal government. This particular infrastructure is focused on water, sewer, and broadband. So those are the 5 categories at a very high level of where these dollars can go. So what does this mean in kind of a large sense, and where does Guidehouse play a role in helping the city of Akron be successful with thinking through the compliance and eligibility of these projects? One of the things that we focus on is really capturing and making sure that we're hearing from the community, and that's why we're doing this type of informational session right now. Part of that is getting ideas and understanding what the public cares about and what is most going to be impactful. And also understanding where private, nonprofit sectors and other public sectors, such as the state and the county, are currently making their own investments. We really think about this as an opportunity of maximizing that funding. So it's not just the city of Akron's dollars going to community violence prevention, but it's the states or the counties, money going to those efforts as well. Really making a multiplicative effect and impact on the community. Secondly is the cost tracking and accounting. So while the city still has to maintain all of the services and do its day-to-day jobs, we also now have $145 million to be tracking. And that's where Guidehouse really comes into play. We're just keeping track of how invoices are coming in, how we're spending the money, making sure that it's eligible, but the city is really the one taking the lead, setting the priority, setting the focus. We're just kind of keeping track of where everything is so that they can continue to focus on those really important services that you all depend on as residents. Third is being a liaison between the community. So we want to make sure that we're providing clear channels of communication, that questions that the community might have or residents might have are getting answers. And that's why we've committed to doing these informational sessions. And also I will be in Akron at different wards, having conversations and providing as much information as I have to residents who are interested in learning more. And then guidance and training. So we know that we want to not just kind of do all of these things and then hope, kind of wish the city well. We want to make sure that the city is set up for success ongoing. We know that there's going to be a certain point that Guidehouse might leave, and we want to make sure that the city is set up well for any sort of audit or any sort of information that they need to provide as far as backup. And so we provide memos. We're in weekly meetings at the very least with the city government, talking about eligibility and frameworks of eligibility for these dollars and how we have to think through these different projects. And through that process, by sharing that knowledge, we're really trying to make sure that the city is set up well for the future. And then finally, compliance monitoring. And that's where a lot of that memo writing actually comes in that we do, making sure that we are providing everything in a single place repository for any upcoming audits or any sort of justification that might have to be made later on for the federal government, so that you don't have any worries about clawbacks from the federal government or any concerns that the money that was spent was not in compliance with the expectation the federal government has laid out, and possibly leaving the city of Akron to cover that with their own general funds. We want to make sure that these are the dollars that we're able to spend, and we're spending it in a way that is within the guidelines that the federal government and Treasury has provided. So I talked a little bit about our community engagement. Like I mentioned before, these public information sessions are really at the core where we want to make sure we're capturing these questions, providing answers to them, and sharing those answers out publicly. We're also going to have a project spending dashboard where you're actually going to be able to see how the $145 million is being spent down by the city and city council. We're focused as well on a racial equity framework. We understand, and the federal government understands, that different populations were not impacted in a similar way because of the pandemic. We know that there was a disproportionate impact on different communities of color, and we want to be really thoughtful about that, and the city wants to be really thoughtful about that, and city council wants to be really thoughtful about that. And making sure that we are creating a framework that takes that into account, so that our populations that have seen disproportionate impacts in their communities are really getting a fair and equitable chance to participate in the recovery. And then also to targeted efforts to gather input. We're really excited about hearing from the community. The administration and city council really wants to hear from residents, because we understand that residents know what the city needs. You guys are living in the city every day, and your priorities are that of the administration and city council. And so in order to facilitate that, we've actually created a public input form. And this public input form is a very simple Google Doc that anyone can go to. I'm actually going to take us through, but the purpose of this is really an opportunity to hear from the different residents and their opinions on what they want to see in their community and how these dollars need to be spent down. So hopefully you all can see my screen. I'm showing the public input form. And like I mentioned, this is something that you'll be able to access right from the City of Akron's website. So if you go to akronohio.gov/ARPA, you'll be able to put in the public, you'll see a link to this public input form. And you'll be able to provide very basic information about yourself so that we'll be able to get in contact with you and ask additional questions. We'll ask about, what entity or what group you're representing, where this project might be, the zip code. And then we ask for a couple more questions about what type of projects you want to see. What are the impacts that you want to make? It's only 2 pages. It probably would take you less than 10-20 minutes to fill out if you already have an idea about what you would like to see. And then we are going to be actually reviewing that and having weekly discussions on the ideas that we're getting and making sure that we get a chance to either combine or encourage collaboration for those ideas. We're really excited about this because we think it's going to be a really great way for people to participate and play a really valuable role in this process. So I really know that when we first talked about doing this, the idea of hearing directly from the community was at the top of everyone's mind. And we're glad that we're going to be able to really do that through that form. Well, I'm going to go back to the presentation. So part of what I mentioned previously that Guidehouse is responsible for and working in tandem with the city is the reporting requirements. So the city is ultimately responsible to the federal government to report on how it spends its money. And there's a quarterly report that has to go out. We've already filled out one report so far, and that was submitted August 31st in 2021. And that covered the period from when the city received the funds to July 31st, 2021. I want to be very clear that in that time, no dollars were expended. So I don't want anyone to think, oh, we're already, all of the money is already spent. We're kind of just doing a look back on what happened. That is not the case. As of right now, that report showed that there were 0 obligations and 0 expenditures. We are having our next deadline come up January 31st, 2022. And we are looking forward to working with City Council, hearing from residents, getting the opinions of nonprofits, the private sector, states, and the county on figuring out how we can best spend these dollars. And we'll capture those obligations that the city feels best reflects those priorities that we're hearing from the residents. A couple of things just to know about, we're really focusing on the project demographic information. We want to know which communities these dollars are going to spend. The federal government needs to know that. We're also making sure that we are capturing a lot of information, especially for those grant or subawards that are over $50,000. And this has to do with single audit compliance and additional regulatory processes that come into play with the expenditure of these dollars. So reporting requirements are really important. We're keeping track of those key dates and timeframes, and also making sure that we're setting the city up well to report on them. So far, we have heard from the city a couple of different areas of priority, and we're really excited because these align really well with what the federal guidance has provided us. So when we are thinking about small business growth, for example, that aligns really well with thinking about the negative economic impacts that we've seen throughout the city of Akron. We're really looking forward to thinking about parks and public spaces, knowing that those investments and those places were valuable throughout the pandemic as far as ways for communities to remain active and to get out of their houses under lockdown. Housing, we know that housing stock has been impacted because people were not able to make the sort of investments in their homes that they would have liked to over the course of the pandemic, and higher use of those homes with being home more. And of course, violence prevention as well. And we have public utilities and access to healthcare and social services as other priorities that the city really wants to focus on. With that, I want to encourage everyone on this call to also share the priorities you're most interested in seeing. And again, using that public input form to really participate in this process. We won't know if we don't hear from you all. So really the best way to become involved and to have your voice heard is by sharing that input through that form and making sure that your opinion is shared with folks who are really interested in hearing how we can best make the expenditure of $145 million, which is kind of once in a lifetime transformational amount of money coming into the city, meaningful to the residents here in Akron. So with that, I will finish the presentation and see if there are any questions that came in.
Okay, thank you so much. So now is your opportunity to actually place your questions right into the chat. And I am going to ask that our council clerk, Sarah Biviano, give us the first question.
Sure. So Gina Burke asks, in which category is broadband?
Great question. So broadband actually falls into our infrastructure investments. And there has been a lot of discussion around broadband and investments in broadband. And the federal government has said that their focus is really that infrastructure, so building out infrastructure so that people have access to broadband. But there are other ways to think about broadband as well. I know that you may live in a city in which broadband is easily accessible. There might be very good coverage, but just because something is easily accessible doesn't mean that there is equal access to broadband. And that might be because of inability to pay or struggles that folks might have had with accessing internet. There are different ways that we might think about that, but the federal government has created a specific category around disproportionately impacted communities. We know that broadband was really important when it came to making sure people could do their job, go to school. So there are different ways that we might think about that. And so with broadband specifically, it falls into that infrastructure investment, but it can also fall into disproportionately impacted communities or negative economic impacts that we saw throughout the pandemic.
Our next question comes from Jackie Silas Butler, and that is, will there be any residency requirements as it relates to those seeking funds and or receiving services?
So as far as the eligibility of the funds must be spent inside of the city of Akron. However, if you're a person who runs a nonprofit but doesn't live in the city of Akron, but would like to seek funds possibly for your nonprofit or share an idea or a program that your nonprofit is doing that serves the residents in Akron, then that is eligible. It is more about where the dollars are expended than who is necessarily sharing the best idea. Part of what we do actually is share best practices around the country. So we know that some great ideas might come from different cities like the city of Detroit or the city of San Diego. And we don't want to limit ourselves to, where someone lives just to kind of hear good ideas. But we do want to make sure that those dollars are serving the residents of the city of Akron.
Alyssa Figueroa asks, in regards to housing investments specifically, Are there any incentives for updating, renovating of rental properties? What guidelines are there for the new affordable housing construction financing?
So I can go ahead and take this one. We are still developing out the programming as it relates to housing, but would love, any feedback that you have for ideas. You can share them in that public input form, but we're really looking at how can we increase affordable housing in the city of Akron? How can we help homeowners in the city of Akron in regards to rehabilitating their properties? And so we are doing a lot of research currently as to those programs and how we're going to roll those out to the community. So stay tuned, but also if you have a great idea, please submit it to the public input form.
We just want to remind everybody that the link is in the chat for your reference to the public information form. And Shelly, I think this question will be best directed to you. It comes from Ben Gifford. What is the time frame for the public input form and how long will it remain open?
So this is going to be a long process, as the city of Akron has years to spend these ARPA dollars. So the public input form is going to be open indefinitely. So we will be pulling down the ideas frequently and evaluating them and contacting people for more information and information gathering based off of when you submit the form, but it is not going to close at any particular time in the near future. So we have, years to spend these dollars, and we'll be continuing to look at what other cities are doing and what our community is stating the needs are to continue to develop programming as well as assisting the community.
Shelly, I think this one will also be for you. This is from Gert Wilms, and she asks, when will grant applications be available? Is there a set grant submission deadline?
We're still working on this as well. I would suggest, again, putting in your information in regards to your program in that public input form, and we can contact you about your grant application. I do know that we are planning on launching the violence prevention grant programs and the form that will be accompanying it for people that are interested in doing violence prevention programming. That will be being launched here in the very near future. But in regards to other grant programming or ideas, the public input form would be where you should submit those at this time.
Shelly, this question is probably also for you.
Okay.
How will companies, this comes from Janelle Wagner, and it's how will companies submit bids to work on the projects? Absolutely.
So one of Mayor Horgan's passions is obviously to keep business local and to look at diversifying our spend. So that is a commitment that is going to follow through with these funds. Everything that we're going to do in regards to spending these funds and procuring items has to fall in line with the federal procurement guidelines. It has to go through a competitive process. So the city of Akron is currently using a new software called Bonfire, which is on our website, on our purchasing page. I encourage everyone, if you are a business, to sign up on Bonfire, and you will get emailed every opportunity that there is to compete on projects in regards to procurement at the city of Akron, because we definitely want to utilize our local minority businesses, women-owned businesses in the city of Akron, and really keep these dollars within the city as we're doing these projects. So we are very excited about that, and encourage you to sign up on that new software that will allow you to get email notification of all competitive bidding opportunities.
Our next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
Yes, it's okay, Sarah.
Sorry.
This question comes from John Garofalo. What funds that will be distributed with funds that will be distributed to hire new staff to advance programs? Is there a commitment an organization has to make to keep the staff on board once the funds run out?
So every organization is going to have to evaluate kind of their staffing levels and how they can advance these programs. I know that we have certain nonprofits that may just hire or contract with certain staff during periods where they have additional grant funding, and that may be what is the best for spending these dollars. But no, I don't think that the organization is going to have to make a commitment to keep staff on board once the funds run out. That would be, up to the organization to determine, if they can sustain that.
Next question comes from John Beatty. He says the city has spent millions of dollars on those rich enough to build new housing or to add to our houses and tax exemptions for 15 years out. I am concerned for the least of these Akron residents. I have specific plans and hopes for the homeless. The problem for homeless is no one wants them to have housing in their neighborhood. I have a plan for housing on city property that actually helps the homeless improve their situation. What is the city plan for helping the homeless?
The city of Akron has other ARPA dollars that we have received from the federal government, emergency shelter grant dollars, home dollars, that we will be utilizing to help our homeless population. We are continually evaluating through the continuum of care how to best serve the homeless population in Akron, and we will continue to do that with the federal dollars that we've received from the federal government for emergency shelter and for home.
The next question is from Justin Chenault. And the question is, will any funds be allocated directly to Akron CDCs or middle neighborhoods?
Absolutely. So that is what we're continuing to evaluate. We are going to be looking to partner with our CDCs, all CDCs around the city of Akron, to work through some of these housing initiatives. So again, I wish I had more detail to share on that at this time, but we are working through the development of those ideas and how we can engage all of our neighborhoods and increase housing in those neighborhoods.
This next question is from Ben Gifford, and he asks, how much is the city paying Guidehouse, and where do those funds come from?
Yeah, great question. So Guidehouse can be paid through the ARPA dollars. So it is all cities our size, most cities our size are hiring, compliance and audit specialists to help us through this process, as the federal regulations are very onerous. So we will be utilizing a portion of the ARPA dollars to pay for Guidehouse. Guidehouse, I don't know how much it's going to cost. It's based on time and materials. So really how much guidance we need is how much we will end up paying Guidehouse. So they only charge us when they're actively working on things for us, and we have questions for them, or we need guidance from them on certain items. I am a very frugal finance person, so I want to minimize what we're paying them as much as possible. And if it's something I can research or figure out on my own, trust me, I'm going to try and do it. But we ultimately needed someone to come in and help us to make sure that we were doing everything correctly and that we were not going to run afoul of the federal government, because this really is not mine or the finance director's wheelhouse. So we needed to engage experts to make sure that we were protecting ourselves and the city, and making sure that these funds are not going to be clawed back by the federal government.
Shelly, I think this question would be for you
Sure.
as well. Dee McCall has a concern that local organizers that are working with those in need, why they were not hired as opposed to Guidehouse. So could you go back and talk a little bit more about the RFQ process and those companies that applied, and why Guidehouse emerged as the final selector?
Absolutely. So this is very specialized work, and we needed to have experts on board that really have that experience working with the federal government, working with federal dollars. Guidehouse has worked with people on FEMA dollars, as well as the this is the American Rescue Plan CARES Act. So making sure that we're following all of those federal guidelines. And so We went through a competitive process. We did very intensive uh, comprehensive interviews. We wanted to find the best partner who had that very detailed experience to help guide us through this process. And Guidehouse rose to the top through that process. If there was someone that could locally do that for us, that had that specialty, we would have definitely considered them. But ultimately, this normally tends to be larger firms that are not located locally that specialize in the federal compliance and audit process.
Ben Gifford also asks, are there any ways in which the city can use ARPA money to supplement parts of its existing budget, potentially freeing those funds for spending without ARPA restrictions?
Yes, we can. So we can do, so there is a lost revenue calculation that we can do. It is quite a complex calculation that, that would be way difficult for me to explain here, but we'll be able to do that every year through 2024 to kind of calculate where do we see that we have lost revenue after the onset of the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic, and we can utilize some of the ARPA funds for those lost revenue dollars. However, I will caution that that will likely be used to kind of balance the city's budget because we are going to see certain constrictions in certain revenue funds, due to the pandemic, and we'll need likely to utilize some of the ARPA funds just to balance our budget.
And I can just add just super briefly to that. While it can remove certain restrictions around spending, it can't remove all restrictions. And in fact, the city of Akron is still responsible for any dollars that it claims as revenue loss to report on how those dollars are spent. And there is still an expectation from the federal government that the dollars will be spent with respect to addressing and helping the recovery due to pandemic. It's a little bit looser, the rules around those revenue dollars, but there is still some very pretty specific requirements around reporting for those revenue dollars.
Do we have any other questions?
We just got another one from Jacqueline Silas Butler. She asks, if the courts make the determination that remote workers are taxed from their city of residence instead of the place of employment, will that count as lost revenue?
Correct. Yeah, and we anticipate that we are going to have a downturn in our tax revenues because of the remote work issue. So yes, that will count as lost revenue, and we will be able to utilize some ARPA funds to balance our budget in the interim.
In the last few minutes that we have remaining, we have 2 questions from members of council that we want to acknowledge, and these will be in addition to the one that just popped in the chat, the last 3 questions that we'll be answering. If your questions have not been answered online, we have your email address and we can answer, you can put them in the chat and we'll send out a mailing afterwards with any answers to questions that have not been posed during the webinar. This question comes from Councilman Phil Lombardo. As far as housing goes, are those 4 bullets set in stone or can other ideas be suggested?
I think we're completely open to new ideas, and that's the public input form that even council members can submit their ideas through. So I encourage, if you have, we're looking for great ideas. So if you have a great idea that is not encapsulated right here, please submit it, and we can start working to research that idea and have a conversation with you about the idea.
Councilwoman Amobian asks, will these dollars be used to purchase homes in Akron by residents who are living in older homes that they have rented for years?
currently that's not a program that we have identified, but I think that, if you would like to submit that idea, that through the public input form, I think that's something that we can talk about with you and discuss and get more information about what that would entail, and we can research that.
And the final question is from D. McCall. How is the loss of revenue tracked? And who is the person being accountable to find out if it's not going someplace that it should not go?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, it is a complex calculation that the United States Treasury has actually outlined for the city of Akron. We are working with accountants at Raymond and Guidehouse in order to do that calculation. We did that calculation over the summer. Then we had to report that to the federal government. We have to keep the documentation as to how we came to the number that we came to and justify it, so that when we are audited, we can be able to explain the rationale. So it is definitely a very complex calculation that all cities across the United States have to calculate for this revenue loss bucket. And we are, responsible for reporting that to the United States Treasury and then utilizing those funds to stabilize our budget.
And I'll just add on to that as well, that even though this is considered revenue replacement, and the calculation that we have, again, goes against that $145 million that the city of Akron has, and basically can go into the general fund. Even with that, there are still requirements on reporting. So for example, the city of Akron, says that they have a certain amount of revenue loss that happened over the course of calendar year 2020. They are able now to remove some of the restrictions that the American Rescue Plan puts on those dollars, but they're not able to not report to the federal government on what they spent that money on. The federal government wants to make sure that they have an understanding for even the things that maybe don't fall directly in line with the legislation, that they know how cities are spending that money. So the federal government is very, very protective of how cities and states and counties are spending that money. We know that there is going to be an audit process. There will be an audit process on this, and that happens yearly with any large federal award. And of course, too, the dashboard will also be able, the public dashboard of spending that we're going to share on the City of Akron's website will also give citizens a way to keep everyone accountable, along with the auditors from the federal government.
We have one final question, and that is coming from Councilwoman Tara Mosley. Will ARPA funds be available for business mentorship programs to assist in business growth?
Absolutely. And I think that is something that Heather Roschak from the city of Akron has been kind of researching and has proposed an idea in that regard. So definitely that is something that we are looking at that is important to the community. So if you have any input, I would suggest reaching out to the Office of Integrated Development with any ideas that you have, or sharing it with this public input form, and we can get those back to them. But that's absolutely an area that's going to be important as we move through this recovery phase from the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Great questions. Also, just a reminder, if we did not get a chance to answer your question, going to let you know you can still put that question into the chat. We do have everyone's email address, and we will make sure that all questions get answered. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to working with each and every one of you as we build back a better and stronger Akron. Thank you.